Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we can start now. A warm welcome. My name is Katarzyna Pisarska. I'm with the Kazimierz Pułaski Foundation. I'm the president of the Warsaw Security Forum. It is my great pleasure not only to moderate the meeting today, but also, as Kazimierz Pułaski Foundation, it is my honor to be the co-organizer of today's meeting, which is dedicated to NATO Summit in Vilnius. When I met Minister Siwiera back in December, when we talked about strategic debates at the National Security Bureau, we touched upon two goals of the debates. On the one hand, about the goal to gather experts, to gather persons who are interested in the topic of security and to broaden our understanding of threats, but also the possibilities which are opened by those big changes happening right now for Poland. On the other hand, however, we also wanted to reach a broad circle of recipients, persons interested in the area of security, so that we strengthen a certain social awareness of what is happening across the globe and how it relates to Poland. The first part of our debate today is an open one. It is recorded, and we hope that it is going to be conducive to strengthening social awareness. In that second part, we will meet with you. We've got a whole range of eminent experts, and then we will go more into details of individual problems and challenges. We are going to hear two voices from different milieus concerning the threats and also what we can expect to see at NATO Summit in Vilnius. Let me start, however, by presenting the guests in the first part of the debate. We have with us General Andrzej, Chief of General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces. Welcome, General. And from Brussels, we have with us Ambassador Tomasz Szatkowski, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Poland at NATO. Welcome. Next to Ambassador, we have Professor Jacek Czaputowicz, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland. Welcome, Minister. We have with us also Mrs. Justyna Gotkowska, Deputy Director of the Center for Eastern Studies. And last but not least, Mr. Marek Budzisz, a journalist, columnist, analyst, strategy and feature. A warm welcome. So, before we follow with our discussion, let me firstly and most importantly extend my very warm gratitude to the National Security Bureau for organizing strategic debates. These debates are exceptionally necessary. The first debate has showed that, and I hope also today's debate will follow suit. Thanks to these debates, different milieus, different circles can sit down and speak about the concept of security. My particular thanks go out to Minister Jacek Siwiera, who initiated those debates, and let me pass him the floor and ask for introductory remarks. Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for opening our meeting. Thank you very much for helping with the organization, and thank you for co-organizing our project. Thank you to our eminent guests for accepting the invitation. We are aware that the debate on security-related matters, especially a debate preceding such a historic event as NATO Summit in Vilnius, requires also from its participants, from those who will take part in NATO, a deep, substantive, and thoughtful debate concerning our expectations, our demands, but also concerning the question what NATO will look like after Vilnius Summit. There are 3 months left, ladies and gentlemen, till NATO Summit in Vilnius. 3 months filled with hard work of the diplomats, huge intellectual effort from military planners, big involvement from the public administration bodies, However, the 3 months amidst Russian Federation in Ukraine will be the months which will shed either light or shadow on the decades which are facing us. And the challenge facing NATO in this time particularly is totally different than how we saw the capability to deter over the last 30 years. Ladies and gentlemen, on the one hand, the world in which we are living has become much less secure. A multipolar world means for countries such as Poland in this part of Europe, a world which is much more unstable, a world which is much more stricken by crises. Also, speaking about natural processes, but these are very often used and utilized on purpose, such as, for example, artificial migration crisis. On the other hand, however, in this unstable world, the cards that the Republic of Poland has in its hands are much bigger than those which we had before the aggression happened, the aggression by the Russian Federation in February 2022. These cards are the cards of credibility, ability to have its impact in the region, the capabilities to set up bilateral relations, military ones, projection or export of security, but also the export of armaments. In the next decades, these aspects will shape the security of our state. Hence, the answer to the question what will come after Vilnius should lead every single debate preceding the summit. Within the next 3 months, we should always be asking ourselves the question not about what will happen in Vilnius, but what will happen in the decades which are ahead of us. And this has got a couple of dimensions, but let me briefly describe 3 of them. First of all, a purely military security. Very often, among the political leaders, civilian leaders, what is missing is the ability or need to think about the security along the lines of time and space. The mind of a soldier is constructed in this particular way, and I do agree. We used to talk about it with General Andrzej. And I do agree that every single challenge and every single task is projected into the space, which has to provide the space for the implementation and into time. And these are the categories which we need to take into consideration when thinking about purely military security. But to make sure that this thinking is efficient, in order to have the right resources, we also have to think about the economy. And we have an upper hand over our opponent, the main threat of the North Atlantic Pact. In the Soviet sphere, the easiest thing to do is to make a decision, is to sign a decree. And the carrying out of the tasks in this space, the entire machine which is set into motion. After this step, which is quite easy to take, the decision to switch the economy into a war mode, this machine needs time, it needs resources, it needs also people. And it faces certain problems in every single dimension. A free market economy is much quicker to adapt. A free market economy, especially the one which we know from the United States, is the economy which reacts instantly. Wherever there is money, there very often, very quickly, is the production capacity and the catering for needs. We were able to see that with our own eyes during the COVID pandemic, for example, but also during other crises. Of course, the scale of challenges is incomparable comparable. However, this pyramid in the world of the West is reversed. What is most difficult to do is not to adapt the economy. The most difficult is the decision-making process. The most difficult thing is to allocate funds to implement orders. In the Kremlin, the easiest thing is just to sign a decree. In the countries of the West, the most difficult thing is to make the decision. The economy will follow, the resources will follow. The third aspect is the security of the Polish state, construed also as security for investments and investors. Following slightly into the footsteps of South Korea and Israel, which also have unfriendly neighbors, Poland needs to learn how to live in the environment with the risk of being an eastern flank country will not impact the international perception also among investors, where it is not seen as a factor which constrains the capabilities of our state to receive international investments and to cooperate. And this is the also aim of the planning at the NATO Summit. So what we need to do is to ensure the adequate level of deterrence, to make sure that these conditions are fulfilled, so that it is possible to say with pure consciousness that Poland is safe and secure not only today, but also in the coming decades. In order to achieve that, what we need to do is to have that deterrent aspect in mind. What we need is deterrence by denial, and not only deterrence by punishment. So not deterrence based on the assumptions that we are able to respond to aggression and to plan response to aggression on our territory. But deterrence is efficient when, in a realistic way, we prove that we are ready to defend. Ladies and gentlemen, it is quite simple as I see it. Contrary to the appearance, it is just psychology, just like in the techniques of intervention. It's similar as in confrontation, when you need to use a weapon. One of the basic methods of deterrence and evoking respect is the fact that a police officer has a gun with themselves. NATO was at that stage before. It had weapons in its hands. Then, the next element of deterrence, when a dangerous situation appears, when there is a danger in the vicinity, when somebody resorts to violence in the vicinity, it's not about shooting. You have to adopt the right stance. You need to be ready to take out your gun. Ladies and gentlemen, whoever had a gun in their hand before, who was confronted with that situation, knows that nothing is going to deter. Not the fact of having the gun is the most eloquent deterrent. What is most needed is a calm, conscious, and determined look of a person who is ready to take out a gun and defend themselves. NATO has to construe its readiness to defend in this way. We are not at a stage where it is enough to have a gun or a weapon to deter. We need to be ready to adopt the right stance to defend ourselves. And this brings consequences. And this is the purpose of NATO. We need to strengthen the chain of command, have proper regional plans, exercises which demonstrate readiness. But first and foremost, it is necessary to demonstrate also political readiness of the entire NATO to defend and to use measures and means which we will have at our disposal. I'm very happy and looking forward to hearing from our experts what their assessment is on the condition which we should expect to have after NATO Summit in Vilnius. I would be interested to find out how they see the years following the Vilnius Summit. I'm curious to hear how much of what we are going to say today we will be able to also incorporate into our expectations, into the policy which we are going to implement during the Vilnius Summit. Because it is not a secret that a big portion of the debate becomes the beginning of future actions in international fora. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. We will try to meet your expectations. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for joining our debate. We have got slightly more than an hour and a half for our conversation. Now, as we said before the debate, what we want to have is a dynamic exchange, which will allow us to sometimes agree, sometimes not to agree with each other. And ladies and gentlemen, I will give you the possibility to open our debate for 5 to 7 minutes. I will ask concrete questions, and then we will have a joint conversation among our speakers. So let me start by asking General Andrzej. General, there is no doubt when we think about the Vilnius Summit, we know that the situation in Ukraine, the necessity to further increase military assistance are going to dominate all the discussions. So let me start our debate by asking this question. General, what is your assessment of the situation on the front line today? What is the chance of an effective Ukrainian counteroffensive? And of course, speaking about Vilnius, but not only in Vilnius, we have seen that in recent days. Can we count on lasting and, first and foremost, increasing military assistance provided by the West to Ukraine, General? Thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank Minister for organizing this debate and for having me here. Katarzyna, on the one hand, it is a big honor for me to be included among these eminent experts. I treat it as a compliment, but I'm a little bit rebellious by nature, and I'm not sure whether it's good and positive that a soldier begins this debate. War is not a matter of the military people. The war has been, is, and probably will remain to be politics. And it's got a lot of economic factors as well, mentioned by the minister. Finances, infrastructure, social matters, technology, production of food. We've got an entire set of problems which have also to be included in the box in order to understand the war. When I look at the war in Ukraine, I see it through the lens of politics. And unfortunately, it does not look good. Why? When we have a closer look at financial instruments within the short-term perspective, I think that for the need of the debate, we can assume that 1 year, 2 years is a short-term perspective. There are no indicators that Russia would run short of money for the war. The instruments that it had before the war, the dynamics of spending, and also the effectiveness of sanctions of the entire economic situation, which is complex, all of that shows that Russia is going to have money to conduct the war. Ukraine has got huge financial problems. We know how big American assistance is and how much the Western countries are helping. We also know what the Polish help is. Poland ranks as the second biggest donor. And I think that we should also set an example for others to a large extent. So we can see that, according to my assessment, in this short-term perspective, if we compare the capabilities of financial capabilities of Ukraine and Russia, well, it does not look good for Ukraine. And we are speaking about Vilnius, but of course also we are looking forward to 2024. We can see that the elections in the United States is upcoming. Looking at all of that, it doesn't look well. It doesn't look good. Now, social matters. I think we know that Ukraine does not have enough people. We are only speaking about the perspective which we're able to see on our border. The big majority of Ukrainians passed our border. So I think there are no indicators to say that within 1 year or 2, there would be good conditions enough for Ukrainians to come back to their country and start the rebuilding process. Part of them left the country due to war. Others were forced to leave, and they're somewhere in Russia right now. Speaking about infrastructure, the whole mechanism which supplies the state energy, If you compare the situation to the one in Russia, well, if you look at the scale, it's bigger in Russia, simply speaking. So in the short-term perspective, Russia still has the possibility to keep up the same level of destabilization. So before I give the military assessment of the counteroffensive, I think it's positive that we also take it into account in this debate today. Of course, it is just an element, but of course, the vast majority are the political decisions, as the minister indicated. But, of course, it's going to be also debated in Vilnius. Vilnius is more about our credibility, not only as NATO, but as the entire West. If we come too late, if we fail to use the opportunity, if we're not determined enough, we will not give Ukraine a chance to build its safe and secure future. 1 year, 2 years. Speaking about a longer-term perspective, well, it is difficult to assess because there are many different factors at play. But today, in my capacity as a soldier, it is my duty to present the most difficult scenarios and variants. It opens up also the field for all those who should be helping Ukraine. My assessment of this security situation is very bad, very dangerous for Poland. Thank you, General. Let me follow up with a short question. Do you think, sir, that there is the awareness of the huge danger if we do not get involved in the West? You have presented a very warning kind of perspective. Are the leaders in the West aware of the fact that we are far away from winning the war, that Ukraine is far away from winning the war? And do you think that they are going to attend the Vilnius Summit with this awareness? I have recently visited Sweden, Finland, and Germany. I had an opportunity and a chance to talk to my colleagues, to listen to them. They have a contact with politicians. I also talked to the president of Finland. Having said that, the perspective of the threat assessment is still a surprise, is still shocking for many, not because they do not understand it, but they have the awareness of the internal situation. We do not have enough ammo, the industry is not ready to send armaments in Ukraine, and the industry is not ready either to produce enough. So the situation of awareness in the West is not as high as here in Poland, and we are passing on this assessment in different fora. We are doing that. Now let me move to Ambassador. Ambassador, you have joined us straight from Brussels. We are preparing for the Vilnius Summit, but in parallel, there are many other things going on. So on the one hand, let me ask you the same question as I asked General. Is there full awareness within NATO about the level of assistance needed by Ukraine today? What is the level of threat? And on the other hand, if you look at the last year, at the implementation of the Madrid decisions, are we pleased after 1 year? Has it been delivered? Have the decisions of Madrid been implemented? Yes, indeed. NATO is definitely one of the main arenas of consultation, and the situational awareness is being built among allies vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. We ask ourselves this question several times, or a few times a week during our briefings. So what is the situation like? I think it is not as dramatic as the General has just presented it, at least from the perspective of a NATO plenary room. For sure, there are reasons for concern. There are reasons to speed up certain actions. What we are focusing on right now is the preparations for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, and I think that there are some moderate reasons to be optimistic. Nevertheless, we should start actions, and we should be demonstrating to the Russian side that, irrespective of the level of Ukrainian success in this offensive, we will be ready to continue our support for Ukraine. I think this can be one of the signals which we may try to send as the Vilnius Summit is approaching. Of course, we should remember about NATO's special role. NATO, due to its success in part, but also due to the fact that it is becoming, in front of our eyes, the NATO that we wanted to accede in 1999, we were not fully aware that NATO was ceasing to be that NATO that we were dreaming about. But now we can say that the process is going on, has been going on since 2014, the process of turning NATO into what we wanted it to be. And there are some visible effects of it, especially taking into account the operation that we are seeing on land, in air, and on the sea. Also, as far as the strategies are concerned, also nuclear strategy. Of course, I cannot go into details. It is a very delicate subject matter. But due to the success of NATO, some of our allies are very cautious to make sure that NATO is an important forum. It is an important forum to work out the common position of the allies. On Madrid, let me start with saying that it is difficult to have a historic summit every single year. So, in this sense, the bar is very high prior to Vilnius. The Madrid summit was extremely important. We adopted a new strategic concept. It was the first big regular summit that we had after Russian aggression against Ukraine. Of course, before that, there were two informal summits or irregular NATO summits. They were also important. The West was forging its response. As far as the strategic concept is concerned, we adopted certain decisions to which we have immensely contributed. So the first concept was deterrence by denial. So making it difficult for the opponent to attack. We were speaking about defending every inch of a NATO territory. Of course, it does not happen overnight, but let me assure you, I can assure you that if we look at the plans which are being developed, the principles of the alliance are taken into account as we work. Of course, the glass is not entirely full. We will be looking at the implementation of the decisions concerning the so-called scaling up of battle groups up to the level of brigades. From the point of view of Poland, this might not be the most important issue. What is most important? Let me follow up on what the minister was saying. It's also a good opportunity to thank the minister for the debate. Also, thank you as the host of our meeting. We should think about ourselves more in the perspective of the provider of solutions, helping others. We should not see ourselves so much as the recipient of assistance, because Poland, through its capabilities, military capabilities, economic capabilities, but also management capabilities, Poland is getting mature to fulfill such a role. And I think this is the context, the lens through which we should be looking at the NATO Summit, also thinking about the construction of the command system. Thank you, Ambassador. Madam Deputy Director, we are speaking about the implementation of the historic decisions taken at Madrid Summit. What is your assessment? You have written at length, you have passed some criticism also on the decisions of the summit. I think that Poland had a bigger appetite 1 year ago. How would you assess the strategic evolution of NATO? Have we attained our goals of Madrid Summit? Can we expect more in Vilnius? First and foremost, we need to stress the fact that for a couple of years, NATO has been evolving. It is undergoing a process of changes. As the ambassador has stressed, NATO is coming back to its roots, the roots of a defensive alliance, not an alliance which is just involved in crisis management operations. And the Madrid Summit with a new strategic concept, which describes Russia as the biggest threat to NATO states, was very important. It was so important not only due to the concept, but also, as the ambassador said, due to the structural change in the approach to collective defense, due to working out regional defense planning, the reform of high-readiness forces, the reform of the command structure, NATO force structure. All those issues are, as I understand, being in the process right now. And Vilnius will take more decisions. After Vilnius, those decisions will also have to be implemented, and that will be a process equally important as the one which is taking place right now prior to the July NATO Summit. I hope that Vilnius will see one important event that Sweden will accede the alliance. Finland is already a member of NATO. The membership of these two states in NATO will, from the perspective of deterrence and defense in the Baltic Sea region, but also in the High North, is going to be important from the perspective of Norway. It will change the strategic situation decisively. It will constrain Russian capabilities to provoke, to conduct aggressive actions. NATO will win two states with significant military capabilities, which will be fully plugged into the NATO planning system. This element is equally important. Speaking about NATO Vilnius Summit, let us hope that Sweden will join the alliance. At the same time, however, we are facing challenges resulting from the implementation of all the decisions. And we are faced with a political perspective towards challenges and threats presented by Russia. It seems that there are states which still believe that Russia's attack on NATO or on one of the countries, member states of NATO, is not really probable. And they seem to be thinking that NATO can have more time to implement all the commitments that we have taken. From the perspective of the eastern flank, I think the view is slightly different. To my mind, the biggest challenge is the speed of investment in defense capabilities, the speed of implementing the regional defense plans, the speed of reforming the forces and investing in one's own defense capabilities. I think these are the main challenges facing NATO countries right now. Thank you so much, Deputy Director. We will come back to some questions in the further part of our discussion concerning the NATO strategic adaptation. But first, let me move on to Minister. Minister, let me revisit briefly the war in Ukraine. My question is, are you convinced that we are learning lessons? You have criticized the normative format repeatedly before as an attempt to solve the conflict in 2014, 2015. In your assessment, if you could make a recommendation, advice to leaders today, what kind of strategy should the West adopt vis-à-vis Russia? And how should we see the relations with Russia, among others, at Vilnius Summit? Thank you for having me at this important debate. That question is a key one. The question is whether NATO countries are learning from the past mistakes. My answer is not clear-cut. I think that some are learning lessons, others not. But generally, we can say, all of us agree that the West made a mistake vis-à-vis Ukraine. But looking at recent statements by some leaders, I'm referring here to President Macron, who keeps talking about strategic autonomy of the European Union, or a certain distance towards the China policy. We can see that this line of policy is constant. So I would say that the countries are not so much learning lessons how to operate in international politics. Of course, they know what their strategic goal is. They know what their long-term geopolitical goals are. And the understanding of these goals is deeply rooted in the strategic culture of those countries. I'm thinking especially about Western European countries, such as Germany and France. Those states can introduce certain corrections as a result of the war waged by Russia against Ukraine. But as I said, this is a correction, but it's not a kind of a learning process which would result in changing the policy. Looking at Germany, this reflection goes further, and a certain admitting that the mistakes were made in betting on Russia are more visible, which means it can make us more hopeful about changing the position of Germany vis-à-vis Russia, Ukraine, and the conflict. But your question includes one institution which, according to me, demonstrates something very important for understanding this war, the Normandy format. Let me remind you, 2014, France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine set up a format. The goal of this format was to solve the conflict, and speaking honestly, it was a pretext to develop relations between France, Germany, and Russia. And to a certain extent, it was a pretext for the European Union itself. I had a conversation about it with Federica Mogherini, a pretext of not dealing with this question. If we compare this format with the format on a nuclear deal with Iran, then the European Union is a side to that agreement, and in the Normandy format, the European Union was not a side, and Poland could not require some kind of policy to be implemented by the European Union. And now let me say words which are well understood within NATO. The Normandy format, let me paraphrase the words of Lord Ismail, the first NATO Secretary General. The NATO was to keep Russians in, Americans in, Russians out, and Germans down. This is quite a strong statement, but I think it touches upon the core. Speaking about the strategic autonomy of the European Union today, what is the strategy? Well, keep Americans out and perhaps Russians in. So I think that the change should happen in this respect, but I'm not sure that it has certainly taken place. Let me now point to certain elements of Polish policy, which was a positive one. It was not effective due to the circumstances. In 2018, Poland made a proposal at a UN Security Council meeting. Poland was also the chair in May. First of all, Poland proposed that the UN should set up a UN peacekeeping operation in Ukraine to monitor the situation. Poland also proposed that a special envoy of Secretary General should be set up for the conflict in Ukraine. That discussion took place. It is still available, and states were against. We are saying that Russia had to say yes. It is true, Russia was not for it, but also France was against. Why? Because France wanted to play out this conflict according to its own interests. So let me say that the actions in the UN forum were taken in understanding with Ukraine. The foreign minister of Ukraine was present in the room, and at a certain point, Ukraine realized where the policy was headed, and it wanted to extend the format to include the United States, the UK, and the European Union, but that was too late. Nobody was interested. So let me also stress one thing in this context. If we look at the policy of the Western countries, France and Germany, vis-à-vis the conflict, if we also look at the role of Poland, I would like to stress that it is not about political party divisions. It is not about who's in power in Poland. For instance, France and Germany do not want to cooperate with a right-wing government, which they describe as a populist government. If there was a liberal government, perhaps it would be different. No, it is not true. In 2014, it was Radosław Sikorski who initiated the Kiev visit, and he initiated the entire rapprochement process. Still, those countries rejected the participation of Poland, showing where we should stand, where our place is, although that government objectively was more in line with the European policy. The incumbent government is concentrating more on the transatlantic policy. So these are important questions. What the changes are in the geopolitical view? Well, these processes are not fast. They require time, years, or even decades. So admitting a mistake is not so obvious. Certain corrections, however, are visible. And answering your last questions, what can be done? Looking at the relations between NATO and EU to Ukraine, there are 5 points which come to mind. First of all, leaving aside a NATO-Russia Funding Act from 1997. I just realized it's been 25 years since this act came into force. Looking at the decisions concerning permanent stationing of significant military forces, including nuclear weapons, on the territories of new member states. Well, this produced the second category of membership. I think this is the right moment. Minister Rau made this statement, official statement, that Poland is going to support it. The second point, NATO-Ukraine partnership in the area of defense and deterrence. The goal would, of course, be Ukraine's membership in NATO. This can happen after the hostilities are over, but the preparations could already start. The military support to Ukraine could be provided so that the potential of deterrence and defense is bigger. Let me also remind you that Poland, as well as other countries in our region, first joined NATO, and after 5 years, they joined the European Union. And sometimes we hear voices like, okay, so perhaps the EU comes first, then NATO. No. A situation for a given state is easier when they fulfill criteria which I mentioned. Setting up a contact group for defense of Ukraine to coordinate military assistance, or perhaps a steering group concerning the most developed weapons. Why should we not invite Ukraine to participate in North Atlantic Council meetings, as it was a case for Finland before Finland acceded, and Sweden has got the same status. And a controversial point on the agenda, but still should be supported, offering Ukraine the collective defense guarantees following or modeled on Article 5. Perhaps for some kind of interim period through the coalition of the willing under the leadership of the United States. So this would entail concrete decisions which would strengthen Ukraine, contribute to its security. Thank you, Minister. I promise you that we will come back to the last point, security guarantees for Ukraine. But let me also now pass the floor to Mr. Marek Budzisz and ask a general question, still an important one. There are different scenarios of how the war could develop. There are different scenarios of the development of the security situation. What are the consequences for Poland? What should we be preparing ourselves for in different scenarios? Thank you very much. There are a lot of things which should be discussed. Let me only flag out certain issues. Of course, we will delve deeper into these matters later. I'd like to quote an excerpt from the speech given by Minister Rau, but Mr. Siwiera did it before because he mentioned a NATO strategy, deterrence by denial. I think this is a matter of essential importance. In my assessment, we are seeing two processes happening. The first process is a certain movement towards seeing NATO's defense system and projection of force along eastern flank. It is good that such a movement was started, but a second issue of huge importance, or maybe even more important, are realistic changes which are happening in this area. Speaking about the first field, we can see changes happening. However, the speed of changes in the second area is not enough, as I see it. First of all, a decision was taken to scale up the EFP groups in Baltic states up to the brigade level. But if you look at how this process is being implemented, I'm not only speaking about the group in Lithuania, this process is very much delayed. And a similar situation, or even worse, as I see it, looking at the declarations made by the government of Canada, is about the Latvian group in Canada, we are seeing a crisis of recruitment at an unprecedented scale. During the COVID pandemic, the recruitment was suspended for 2 years. In 2022, the recruitment plans were implemented. However, the level was only 50% of the expectations. By the way, this is a certain problem in all highly developed Western countries. In the United States, land forces in the last 2 years decreased their personnel by 7%. And still, we are speaking about a recruitment crisis, and discussions are being held about the impact of this crisis on the projection of force and the capability of NATO to allocate and designate significantly bigger forces to the eastern flank. Why is that important? Because according to deterrence by denial in its classical form, assumed a tenfold bigger military presence of allied states in Europe. Of course, that was the consequence of the ratio of forces between the West and the Soviet Russia. But we can be sure that without incremental increase of NATO forces on the eastern flank, we cannot be successful. So this is a key element. Now let me also develop on what, follow up on what Minister Siewierka said. He mentioned the growing role of Poland. And generally speaking, we can speak about the export of security. I believe that the bigger responsibility, the bigger role, will come to the eastern flank states, or the eastern front, as General Hodges puts it. So we will have to make sure that investment into our own security has to translate into exporting security to the neighboring states, because our allies from the West, including the US allies, it seems, are not going to be capable, not so much willing as capable to undertake such activities. So this is the first key factor of strategic importance. The second factor, equally important, when Finland joined NATO, the border between Russia and NATO is doubled. And when the new military doctrine of Russia and Belarus is published, and according to what Minister Shoigu said less than 2 weeks ago, it will happen in the nearest future. This border will increase even further, and that will result in another obligation. At the planning level, we will have to take into account, to accommodate those changes. This is a public part of our debate, so I think that certain questions have to be spoken out loud. I think that Poland will not avoid reinstituting the system of general military training for men and women, and we should discuss about it in a clear, open and honest manner. We are not going to increase our military capabilities. We are not going to increase our possibility to export security to the neighboring states without this step. And according to my assessment, we will not increase our resilience as a state. We will not increase also the size of the active reserve force, the resilience system of the state. Let me add one more thing. It is not a coincidence that Latvia has recently decided to also reintroduce general conscription. I think that this is the obvious direction, and we should start a discussion on this one. Also because automatically, whenever we raise this question, we are thinking about the former communist system that we had in Poland. But this is not actually the point. Let me flag out two more issues. Most Western analysts, and I agree with what they say, they believe that the Russian conventional potential that we are seeing used, we can see being used in Ukraine, even if Russia starts rebuilding this potential, in the interim period, for example, till the end of this decade, will make Russia focus more on asymmetric actions below the threshold of Article 5 and actions connected with the nuclear potential that they have at their disposal and which they have modernized. And the last events, not only the declarations on Belarus, but also mapping the seabed of the Baltic Sea, increased activity of Russian ships, merchant ships, all of that shows that this is the direction that Russia is taking. All of this is going to increase the importance of the resilience system of the state at the universal level. That will mean switching and moving on to the realities in which Israel is living. All the citizens of Israel are part of the defense system. And this is another big issue which should be discussed. And now coming back to what the minister said about NATO-Russia Founding Act. The security issues are interrelated. Whenever we speak about Poland's export of security, whenever we mention a certain crisis of Canada armed forces, maybe a good solution is to propose that Poland should be the framework nation in Latvia, or that Poland should play such a role together with Canada. So having said that, perhaps a concept could be worked out of not a rotational but a permanent presence of Polish military contingent in Latvia, or perhaps in other states as well. One reason is we are hearing that the Baltic states in operational sense have to be treated as a uniform kind of area. In conclusion, that would mean that we should combine the diplomatic activity mentioned by the minister. There are also concepts of some analysts from Atlantic Council, for example, speaking about the suspension of the NATO-Russia treaty. This could be complemented by a joint position of the B9 countries, for example. I would be interested to get to know the position of Finland and Sweden in this area. Also, this is a certain area in which our diplomacy could become active. That also realistic activities should be taken into account, connected with the dislocation of forces, deployment of forces, and taking on new duties by Poland. These steps could show in a convincing way that there is a real alternative, rather than the principles which are enshrined in the Founding Act. Thank you very much. We have mentioned a lot of points. I think that we can start a debate. General Andrzej wanted to comment, if I may. I agree with Mr. Ambassador. In politics, words are of huge importance. They're immensely important. And I just put down point 8 of the strategic concept in my notebook. It says that Russia is the most significant threat. And here in Poland, it is not a big surprise. We know that. But in many countries, one still needs to repeat it. And that is why I have written it down in my notebook. And I repeat frequently that Russia is the most significant threat. Now it comes to my mind, when I was leaving one of the bases in Afghanistan, the soldiers put up an inscription in the base, in the warrior base, and they said, "Look at our deeds, not words." And if I took this inscription and I would like to replicate it, and I would like to say the same about Vilnius. We will see if the words translate into security. Why am I mentioning this? I've got a very good contact with General Zaluzhny. We often communicate with each other, and I asked him a simple question, a soldier's question, because he has got a big responsibility on his shoulders, which is unimaginable. I asked how he sees a victory. Very often journalists and colleagues ask me this question. So it would be an arrogant stance to answer how victory should look. It is Ukrainians who have the right and also the duty to communicate how they see a victory. So he thought about it deeply, and then he said, of course, we also spoke about military and operational questions. He said, a victory will happen when Russia will not be able to come back. So I asked him whether I could use his sentence. That was a gentleman's conversation. And he said, okay, go and say. If they ask you, answer with my words. So today, if we construe in a literal way what he said, the victory will be there when Russia will not be able to come back. Now, Ukrainians will not be able to come back unless they feel secure. So those 8 or 10 millions without security structures will not be able to come back and rebuild Ukraine. But if they don't do that, then Russia will permanently achieve its strategic goals. It will destabilize the region. It will create threat. They have got the capability to cause crisis in Belarus and in Ukraine. And our defense spending might be impressive. Everybody is following that very closely. Wherever I go and say it, 3% still might turn out not to be enough. And now the question reappears. NATO is coming back to its basic, to its core. Is it the same NATO? Are we able to produce that level of security? I don't feel competent and authorized to make the decision on what Poland should be doing as far as politics is concerned. However, from a soldier's perspective, I feel obliged to pass on what General Załużny said, namely, Russia must not have the possibility to come back. Thank you very much, General. Let us follow up on Minister Czaputowicz's words, the security guarantees for Ukraine. And of course, the key and final thing that for sure is in interest of Poland, the possible membership of Ukraine in NATO. What is your assessment? What should we do as the first step? What is most important? And speaking about membership in NATO, is it a realistic perspective in the coming years? So now, Ambassador, let me start with you. Thank you very much. Membership of Ukraine in NATO is not realistic as long as the war is going on and as long as the war would be a frozen conflict. Speaking about the membership of NATO, the most important decision has already been taken at Bucharest Summit. Now it has to be filled with content and with concrete instruments. And now our task is to use this time to bring Ukraine institutionally closer, as it was the case with Sweden and Finland. They had certain instruments. Those instruments were aimed at bringing very close their defensive mechanisms to the mechanisms of the alliance. And because of that, the whole process could be accelerated. And now we are seeing the quickest accession process in the history of the alliance. It is not a secret, of course. The information could be read in the media. There are certain differences among the allies. Of course, you are not going to share the details with us, Ambassador. Of course, I cannot give all the details. But there is a grain of truth in the press statements. And of course, I do respect allies who are a little bit more skeptical. There are some allies which are doing a lot, helping Ukraine, and they're carrying a lot of burden on their shoulders. Of course, right now, what is the most important thing is to make sure that Ukraine wins. Yes, but the discussion about security guarantees for Ukraine is going on. Madam Deputy Director, do you think it is realistic to implement a scenario presented by the Minister that the guarantees will be extended unilaterally, for example, by the United States, by the coalition of UK and Eastern flank? Are these scenarios realistic? Are they being discussed? And as Poland, should we also participate in this? Well, from my perspective, the best security guarantee for Ukraine is its membership in NATO. This is also how Ukraine sees it. The reason is, if we leave Ukraine in the gray zone between NATO and Russia, in case the conflict is frozen, in case there is a stalemate on the front line, if Ukraine is not a member, then Russia will try to achieve its strategic goal, that is the subjugation of Ukraine. There are different discussions taking place, obviously, among the analysts, maybe not so much at a political level, about extending security guarantees to Ukraine by individual states without guarantees from the United States of America, which would also include nuclear guarantees. In other words, those guarantees which would be on a par with Article 5. It is difficult to say that those guarantees would be treated seriously by Russia. The discussion seems to be going in the following direction. A long-term plan should be set up for military assistance for Ukraine, which would equip Ukraine with military capabilities to defend its own territory in case of a repeated Russian attack. And those military capabilities should also act as a deterrent. But, as I see it, leaving Ukraine in the gray zone between NATO and Russia guarantees that this conflict will prolong, that a crisis will prolong, and that we will see a long-term instability in Eastern Europe. So, what you argue is that until the war comes to an end, it is difficult to imagine that the West would extend security guarantees to Ukraine. I think the probability is low, and I subscribe to what the ambassador said. From Polish perspective, from the perspective of the eastern flank, we should go to all lengths to make sure that there are political possibilities created in NATO, that the military cooperation is tightened, so that in the future the possible membership of Ukraine in NATO comes closer and is possible to be achieved in a timeline acceptable to all members. Marek, you wanted to follow up. It seems to be obvious that in the post-war situation, security guarantees for Ukraine are the best to achieve when Ukraine becomes the member of NATO. But that is an end model, and this can take a couple of years. I do not know what the position of the member states is. I can only look at the media information. According to the media information, not only Western European states, but also our American allies are skeptical about Ukraine's fast membership in NATO. And that means that perhaps what we're looking at is an interim period, and this interim period, I believe, should also give NATO's security guarantees, because what we could see would be a repeated attack by Russia. In other words, when the hostilities come to an end, we cannot exclude a second Chechen war, which was also preceded by peace, which Russia, I believe, consciously violated after some time, because it strived right from the start to review, to change those agreements. So also in the interim period, such guarantees will be indispensable. Of course, they will not be about Ukraine's membership in NATO. There are some proposals extended. Also, analysts have made some proposals recently. We have seen Brzezinski and Verzbo proposals. It's about opening up Ukraine's perspective of NATO membership, achieving a higher level, and also enhancing the cooperation, as mentioned by the minister, reinstating the practice of inviting Ukraine's representatives to NATO bodies, to their meetings. But it does not eliminate the problem of guarantees in the so-called interim period. And perhaps I will exaggerate the situation a little bit. There is a choice that we are facing. If we listen to experts, all the experts that I heard are speaking about the guarantees extended by the coalition of the willing. All the proposals also take into account, as one of the countries who should extend such guarantees, Poland. I believe that is an obvious consequence of where Poland lies, of our so far involvement and potential. Nevertheless, there is a question we will face sooner or later. Our politicians and society as a whole is whether we want to extend such guarantees. Are we able and willing to extend bilateral guarantees? Or are we supporting a collective system, which perhaps would not cover NATO as a whole? This issue is an important one to decide. And one more thing, which is also looming on the horizon, not only among experts. Viktor Orban has recently said in one of the interviews that such a discussion took place at the meeting of the EU leaders. Also, this is being analyzed by experts, namely, whether we should be planning a stabilizing military contingent in Ukraine when the hostilities are over, as a guarantee of the respect of the conditions of the possible peace. Now, if you look at the Brzezinski-Verzbel proposal, you can construe that the post-war guarantees, non-NATO guarantees, should be strong enough to take into account entering war if Russia wanted to renew hostilities. This is a sad proposal. We should not attach ourselves to it too much, but we see the field of the debate which we should initiate before the decision is taken. It is also about Poland. So, in this sense, I believe we are not going to avoid such dilemmas. And as I read the position of the Allies, looking at the so far involvement, I think it is their expectation that Poland would be one of the states which will look for solutions and get involved. So it is not a question about what somebody is going to give to Ukraine. If somebody is going to make a proposal to us, it is a question of what we should do. It is a question how to shape the final system, because without our involvement, we might not have any framework at all. And then, unfortunately, the scenario of the general could come turn into being a never-ending conflict and a significant deterioration of the security situation for Poland. General, and then Minister. Of course, I fully subscribe. First of all, the war needs to be won, without any doubt. This is the chronology of the events. To make things clear, I'm skeptical not because I do not believe in the competences or in the morale of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has got wonderful soldiers with immense potential in terms of planning and executing tasks. I saw them, I talked to them, so my belief in them is firm. But it's not only the army who wins the war. And what we recall as the most simple reference point in history, let us look at the Kursk battle, the Stalingrad battle, or anywhere else. It was not only about tanks, artillery, and air force. First of all, the Ploiești refinery had to be bombed, or other factories in Frankfurt. It was the power of the German economy which allowed to work out Lend-Lease and also achieve success in not only the Battle of Midway, but it was about Americans producing more warships. They had more money to be able to tick the balance to their advantage. So in this point, I absolutely agree. Precondition is to win the war. But then, all the mechanisms have to be set. We are pressured by time. The Ukrainians are buying this time for us. So we have to launch such instruments which will allow us to signal strategically to the Russians that we are considering, that we are creating conditions to make sure that the security system architecture is constructed in such a way that we can flank, protect Ukraine. Thank you, General, and now Minister. The question of guarantees. And should we guarantee Ukraine's membership of NATO? we should also prepare the entire Polish society to make the people understand that we are in a certain security situation amid war. And also the general conscription is another issue worth discussing. Speaking about guarantees, during the war, it is difficult to imagine that the politicians would not be willing to discuss this problem. So, in practice, Poland could be dragged into war and attacked. Poland is a neighboring state, so perhaps we are more exposed than others. Speaking about guarantees, I said on purpose, Article 5, collective defense, we're speaking about the peace, of course. And we mentioned also the coalition of the willing under the leadership of the United States. This is of key importance. Poland, according to me, can consider the non-NATO guarantees extended by a coalition if there is a state which will take responsibility for those guarantees, which will provide security to Ukraine but also to Poland. So we are speaking now about the phase after entering into peace, with a de facto acceptance by Russia, perhaps not de jure, but de facto. And up until that time, there is the concept of a NATO-Ukraine partnership in deterrence and defense, which means that international community should increase Ukraine's potential and make sure that Ukraine itself constitutes a serious deterrent element. Now, you asked also the question about general conscription. It is immensely important. I listened to Minister Siewiera today, but also I listened to what General said very carefully. There is this kind of assessment that we might be facing a military threat. With a negative scenario, it would mean that we would be threatened by Russia. Is it so? If it is, then the question about general conscription is of key importance, because if we are not doing this, it means that either we do not believe that there is a real threat or we are not getting prepared to face it. Now, where is the problem? The problem is that the Polish society does not want to have a general conscription. According to the opinion polls, most people are against it. And how should we tackle such a situation, especially before the elections? It is incredibly complex. And what is going to be decisive here will be the political support, popularity, not, speaking openly, perhaps not, the interest of the country, if this is a true assessment, because of course you can say that it is just a pipe dream, that this physical threat of Poland is not really there. And here I can see a big chance for the president. He's a person with the right mandate, so he could be looking for a political consensus in this particular question to make sure that this problem is treated seriously. Should the general conscription be reinstated? In what kind of form? It would be advisable to achieve support for this idea from different political parties. Is that possible? I do not know. The election campaign is quite bitter, but that would be a challenge for the president. But maybe the president should try it. Madam Deputy Director and then the ambassador. About the general conscription, I think that we should be looking at the Nordic experiences, but also the Baltic experiences in this one. Mr. Budzisz mentioned Latvia. Latvia has not introduced mandatory conscription, but Latvia has introduced service of the universal defense of the state, which can be implemented in different forms. And one of the forms is a military service for a couple of months, but there are also other forms, such as civil service, or service of the civilians. There are different possibilities also. And I think that when starting a discussion in Poland, we should start with presenting the Nordic solutions, because they give a choice to the citizens. So they can make a choice in which area a citizen wants to be involved. There's also this crisis crisis response, civilian crisis response that citizens can get involved into. We are looking at the popularity of the territorial defense forces in Poland. So I believe that a few-month-long military service, if that would be one of the options to choose, well, this could find support among the society. Thank you very much. A very important point. I'm speaking about both men and women. Yes, of course. Marek. Ad vocem, there is no dispute among us here. I was speaking about the resilience of the state, because I'm not only speaking about only conscription. The whole scope of activities which you mentioned should be implemented, according to me. Now, speaking about the general conscription, it is not really my portfolio or my mandate, but if we did not make this decision in 2009, we would have been in a more comfortable situation. But it also opens up a chance to discontinue certain old culture which dominated. That was the universal conscription. Now, in NATO, speaking about the general conscription, well, it is rather approved of than criticized. It is not seen as an anachronistic solution. It looks at the resilience, building the resilience of the state. And by the way, resilience is one of the terms which is applied more and more often. And we are also trying to give it the right place in the policy of the alliance. But now, speaking about Russia, we have spoken at length about Ukraine. I'm not going to mention and tackle the guarantees. It is a negotiation tactic. I think the best guarantee would be the membership in NATO. We all agree on this one. We should be striving to achieve it. What will be possible? Well, in the meantime, we should, of course, assess the situation appropriately in the right timeline. On Russia, at the North Atlantic Council meetings, it is my role to show, to make some headache for the allies and to demonstrate them that the glass is half empty. And here in Poland, I believe I should be showing the glass which is half full. So speaking about Russia, let me recall the decisions made last year. According to those decisions, the NATO-Russia Funding Act is somewhat frozen. That was the decision that was taken 2 days after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The leaders of the alliance passed a statement in which they concluded that Russia violated the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and it is also said that NATO will significantly increase its presence on the eastern flank. So it also refers to a certain language included in the act. There was also a declaration by foreign ministers saying that we are not bound by the language of the NATO-Russia Funding Act as far as the presence of forces is concerned. And now, better sometimes is enemy of good. So maybe it would be best to officially acknowledge that the act is not binding anymore. On the other hand, I can say that Poland is following the following policy. No reference to NATO-Russia Founding Act as a binding document will appear in the official policy of NATO. We and a group of other states believe that this act is not binding for us in any way. There might be a group of allies who has theoretically a different point of view on whether this instrument is still there, but in practice it means that the most probable thing is that this is a frozen act. Now, general conscription and Russia as such. Let me start by cooling down the emotions, speaking about the general conscription. Of course, if such a decision is taken, we will implement it, but conscription is not a silver bullet. The situation is much more complex than that. And let me stress that the directions of the development which we are considering are new concepts, speaking about multi-domain war, speaking about the space or cyber capabilities, all of that opens up a totally different format. I do not want to scare anybody. Let me stress there are different forms of service today, and citizens can use different forms. There is the territorial defense force, where you can combine your professional activity and service in the armed forces, and also this voluntary military service is another option. This is a prudent approach to the topic. So, having F-35 jets, we are about to start trainings for pilots soon. This puts us in a totally different place because 5th-generation aircraft is not flying over Ukraine. We cannot actually talk about it so much or at length. And speaking about the Nordic models, of course, I subscribe to what you have said. I talked about it both in Sweden and in Finland, about the organization. Still, let us say that we should not take out of the cultural context certain concepts. Finland was admired by us for a long time. Its geography is smaller, but it's able to provide a big number of reserves. Now, they have got a 1,300 long kilometer border with Russia. They have got several thousand strong army, and this puts them in a totally different situation. There is a prime minister in Finland who can press a button and start mobilization. We're speaking about a totally different scale. So having bigger armed forces who act as a deterrent factor is a more proper solution than another solution, speaking about reserves. But I do agree. I was absolutely surprised by Sweden and also their voluntary military service. Having said that, there are different solutions. We've got our own. First of all, a modern approach, multi-domain war, the war that we can afford, and something that we should plan in order to face up to the threats. And the threats are coming. There is no doubt about that. Thank you very much. There are 2 or 3 big topics: Russia, China, and transatlantic relations, including the United States. But let us start with the biggest challenge to NATO and to Poland, that is Russia. I think nobody has illusions in Poland that we cannot expect any positive scenarios for changes happening in Russia. Everyone, it seems, is preparing only for negative scenarios to happen, scenarios according to which we have to be prepared for many years or even for many decades for conflict, for asymmetric activities, and in the worst case scenario for a war with Russia. I would like to ask you, it is a public debate that we are having and speaking about different ideas, conscription and so on and so forth. We have also to make our listeners aware of what the main threat is to Poland presented by Russia. What kind of attack? We were speaking about asymmetric attacks. Should we expect or can we expect, and how can we prepare ourselves better? So maybe let me start with the general. I know this is not a simple question. Not everything can be said in a public debate, but still, how do you think? What should Poles know? What should they be aware of? I would reverse the question a little bit, perhaps. I'm looking at Krzysztof Wojciech. He happened to use an interesting formulation. Of course, you are the author, sir. We should concentrate less on how the future war should look like, and we should think more how the Republic of Poland would employ its armed forces. We have an agreement that our role is increasing, so I think there is nobody who would not understand that foreign countries are looking at us with great admiration and attention. So we are playing in the first league right now. If we change the methodology and if we said, okay, now we are in the first league, we would like to employ armed forces, it's one of the elements, not the most important one. And I'm speaking about increasing our defense and deterrence. We have got diplomacy and culture, economy. I think that this kind of provoking question will be electrifying. But I'm happy that you also brought up the Chinese question. Even in the United States of America, where I talked in a number of forums, I also said that from my perspective, there are 3 centers of gravity. The first center of gravity in terms of security is Taiwan. Taiwan has an impact on the entire system. Of course, I'm referring to North Korea and China. Iran still has a crisis potential of huge dimensions in the Middle East. Israel also is grappling with huge internal problems, and it is an element of this architecture. And last but not least, Poland. Poland is a key state in terms of having its impact on Russia, as you mentioned. Now, if you look at this picture, there is a basic conclusion that we can draw. Neither Taiwan, the Chinese question, neither Iran in the Middle East is not a basic topic discussed in Brussels within NATO. And considering scenarios about Russia without taking into account the Chinese position, recently we have seen a huge involvement in this respect and meetings between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There is also a situation in the Middle East, in the globalized world. All of that seems to be immensely important, so that would be my comment. Perhaps the ambassador will also tell us to what extent these two centers of gravity, to what extent they impact NATO debate and the meeting in Vilnius. That could be interesting. Thank you. Ambassador, so let me pass on the floor to you. General, there is a slightly different perspective, I would say. As I see it, as some colleagues from the Eastern Flank see it, there seemed to be too much China at the meeting of the North Atlantic Council. Of course, we're speaking here about the US leadership supported with the UK. There was a moment when we feared that this view that the Chinese question might even dominate too much the discussion in the alliance. Let me also stress that NATO also has its focus on the North Atlantic area, and its basic threat is, of course, the aggressive action of Russia and the potential terrorist activities. But, of course, we must not turn a blind eye to the reality which is happening in front of our eyes. We can see those interdependencies. Many allies approached me after the war in Ukraine broke out, and they told me, now you are an important state, an influential country. They expressed their respect and admiration, and usually I said, okay, nothing has changed. Actually, now you came to realize it. You have come to realize the role and the importance of Poland in the geopolitical space. And by the same token, the war and Chinese-Russian interdependence, the visit of Putin and his talks to the Chinese leader early last year, and also the reaction of the West Pacific states, Japan, Korea, Australia. This is becoming more and more visible, but nobody is really opposing it. And also our view is changing in a certain sense. We can see that there is a necessity to consult and to coordinate among the states of the political West. I'm not speaking about geopolitical West. I'm speaking about the countries who are bound by a certain system of values across the world. There will be certain benefits, and we are seeing those benefits. On the other hand, it is not in our interest to accelerate the scenario of a possible collision of NATO, or speeding up the situation where NATO would be the main instrument in containing China. We want to have the positive relations with China. We subscribe to the rule of one China, but of course this matter is prominent, and it will be discussed at length at NATO Summit, that's for sure. And this will be expressed by the presence of the leaders of the Western Pacific states, Japan, Korea, and Australia at the summit. Let me come back to the question about Russia and also the threats and challenges that Russia is posing to us. First of all, I would like to speak about Russian goals. I think they are well known in Poland. Wherever I travel abroad, I always stress them. First of all, it is a total subjugation of Ukraine, creating a buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe, undermining the security system in Europe based on NATO and US presence. And Russia has been waging this war against us in the West for many years, and in this war against us, Russia has been involved in many years. It has been using different instruments, disinformation, cyber attacks, And most probably, recently, Russia has also attacked critical infrastructure. So I think that we can expect also similar actions in the future, or even their intensification. Speaking about the bleakest scenarios, let me give you a slightly different answer. For Poland and the eastern flank, the membership in NATO and the political unity and coherence of the alliance is one of the basic elements of the strategy of deterring Russian aggression. And I think we should be clear about it in the discussions that we are having in Poland. Since 2014, since the first attack on Ukraine, Russia has not decided to attack a NATO member state during this war, although Poland and other states are those countries through the territories of which military support is provided for Ukraine, thanks to which Russia is not able to win the war against Ukraine. It is even failing. And Russia has not decided to attack military infrastructure or anything else in order to stop the military transports from the west to Ukraine. It shows that the deterrence in NATO works. And this is a point I want to stress. The political coherence and the perception of Russia by the alliance is extremely important, especially in the context of deterrence of the Russian aggression. Russia will attack us only if it sees the alliance as weak and divided, if it is convinced that Poland is lonely and alienated. And this kind of perception is important because Russia had a false perspective. And it looked through this perspective when it attacked Ukraine. It saw Ukraine as a weak state, and it saw the West as, or the transatlantic community, as a community which was divided and weak. And because of that perception, Russia decided to launch the attack. Having said that, an important element which we should bear in mind is taking care of the relative coherence of NATO. Despite all the differences, which, of course, are there in NATO, at the political level, and despite certain weaknesses of the allies, also at the military level, still we have to assume that Poland, in our situation, should be playing a much bigger role, and we should be increasing our military capabilities in cooperation in the region. Let me later ask you how to keep this political coherence in the context of elections and so on and so forth, but I know also that Mr. Marek Budzisz wanted to comment. Yes, thank you very much. It seems that we are talking about two areas. First of all, we're speaking about the deterrence. I'm not putting in question the importance of a political coherence. Still, I would like to stress the question of military capabilities. This is an element which we cannot disrespect, especially being in the interim phase from the deterrence policy to a new kind of formula, which would remind us of the containance policy, perhaps, containing. So this is of importance. Describing certain deficiencies in the realistic sphere does not mean that we are putting into question political coherence. However, I believe that this is the way that some of people in Poland understand it. Sometimes we hear that our NATO allies are not quick enough to react to risks. Well, this is interpreted as an attempt at undermining the political coherence of the West. But my understanding of this is different. Now, 3 points on Russia. I believe that in the foreseeable future, Russia will not change its policy. In other words, I don't think it will give up on using a certain pressure, using force in order to attain its political goals. I think this is going to happen in the next few years, or a dozen or so years. I think this element will play a significant role in Russian policy. And by the same token, it will also play an important role in the policy of those countries which want to respond to this Russian pressure. So this is number one. Number two, I think that Russia will not give up on its attempt to subjugate Ukraine, but at the same time, I think that it is preparing a strategic end of war. And let me repeat, the key to achieve this strategic victory of Russia in this war is the future of Crimea. Russia, by militarily controlling Crimea, is able, in the foreseeable future, to block Ukrainian trade on the Black Sea routes. And it gives Russia the tool also to have its impact on the internal policy in Ukraine. Russia is now strengthening its capabilities in terms of its military presence and the scale of the military presence in Belarus. In December last year, a treaty was signed on setting up a joint military grouping, and there are no limits set forth, so it can be quite flexible in its reaction. We should also remember about the declarations concerning nuclear weapons and means of delivery, which have already been stationed in Belarus. Having said that, I believe that even if we take it into account that Russia is going to lose this war, you can hear these voices even in Russia quite frequently. Recently, there was a Prigozhin article where such a thesis was formulated. This, however, does not make Russia give up on its strategic goals. And the strategic goal of Russia is to have the following position, is to have Crimea still under its control and to have a position strong enough to be able to influence or even start another element of military attack in Ukraine. And I believe that is the reason why Ukraine wants to regain Crimea so much. And this is also one of the reasons why Victoria Nuland said that Crimea should be a demilitarized area. That should be the end effect. Maybe that means that the one who controls Crimea controls the situation in the Black Sea. And it is either done by Russians or done by the Western forces. There is no interim formula here. And the results of the situation are very clear as well. If the West controls Crimea, or if nobody controls Crimea, then Ukraine can normally function, develop itself, rebuild itself, and attract investments. And Russians in Crimea make it very difficult to rebuild Ukraine and to ensure its future development. And I think this is the question of key importance. Speaking about the strategic situation, this is going to be decisive about the assessment on who has won the war. Russia has not implemented its political plans at this stage. It is clear, it is obvious, without any doubt. But today Russia wants to have a strategic position which will allow it to come back to the game in the future. Thank you very much. Now we will open the next round of questions. But first, Minister, if you could comment on Russia. I think that in the political discussion, Poland should stress the fact that it is for Ukraine than against Russia. It is more audible, it is more acceptable. We are supporting Ukraine. Russia is violating international law, and because of that it is violating international order, as was established after the Second World War, which is based on the UN Charter. This position cannot be attacked, it cannot be challenged. But I subscribe to the analysis. They are necessary. Russia is imperialist. Russian citizens support the war. They're not going to change, and so on and so forth. But all of that is not a discourse or a discussion which gives us understanding. I think it should not be followed by the politicians in Poland. But if we look at the changes which are happening right now as a result of the war of Russia against Ukraine, until recently we had a liberal approach. Through trade, globalization, cooperation, we can eliminate war. And the economic issues are decisive. No, this war has shown that wars are still on the table. So the conclusion is the following. We should get ourselves prepared to win the wars. And indeed, increasing defense spending, modernizing the armed forces in Poland and in other countries, this is the conclusion. And one comment on what General Andrzej said. He said that, as a matter of fact, the armed forces is an instrument of foreign policy. There is a certain doubt that I have. Immanuel Kant was the one who said the army had to be liquidated in order to have peace, because the existence of the army is conducive to war. So there is a certain risk. Of course, the army is necessary. It can also be used in peacekeeping operations. Maybe the UN missions can be led with the involvement of Poland. They can be conducive to peace, but there is a certain risk in this discourse. One could put forward a hypothesis. Russia attacked Georgia, then there was Syria, Ukraine, Africa. So Russia could understand that the army is an instrument of the implementation of foreign policy. So let us avoid the trap and let us not follow along the same lines. We have to demonstrate that that the army is not, well, actually for Russia right now, it is not an instrument to implement its political goals. And, well, I don't read Kant so much as Clausewitz. Maybe I should change the authors, because Clausewitz said in very clear terms. Just to be clear, first of all, Minister, I think you did not understand my words as something that I wanted to decrease the rank or the operational capabilities of the armed forces. I did not say that. I said that the army is an important element, not the most important. The state has got other instruments, diplomacy, economy, culture. Also, however, armed forces are also there. So also the bigger states are doing that. And we have just entered this first league right now. So I'm not deciding anything. It is not my competence. I'm just sharing my thoughts. Now, speaking about soldier-related issues, let me say the following. A simplified communication and saying what Russia is going to do and when is not possible. It is like looking into a crystal ball. It is not really mature to say if Russia does not plan to attack NATO states, including Poland, it is positive. If it has done, then tell me when. Let me draw your attention to something else. Marek Budzisz also commented on it. Unless we show that we are determined enough, unless we give a chance to Ukraine to build such a security system which will allow it to come back to civilization norms, then Russia will have the initiative, and we have a border with Ukraine. Those Ukrainians will not be able to return. They will want to stay in Poland, in Germany, all over the world. And in this Russian war of new generation, I'm skeptical that it's over and it's not binding anymore. They will have a great potential to have an impact. We have a border with Ukraine today. Through the territory of Poland, 8 million Ukrainians have passed. Now, if Ukraine is destabilized, if it sinks into chaos, if Belarus is even more connected with Russia. There is also this frozen crisis there. Recently, the entire European Union was criticizing us for setting up the security system to prevent the illegal migration. And I have no doubt that this was part of the Russian plan. So we have got two states with whom we share a border. And actually, the two missiles fell on the Polish territory. military. So our perception, our determination is not the same as that of other countries. So in my capacity as a soldier, I would say that there is no space and no time here. So not to mention the Kaliningrad Oblast, it has also been somewhat forgotten, but there is still an army stationed there. Now the army has got other tasks. There is also the Baltic Fleet, which is very active. So I would rather say that being restrained or not being effective enough in helping Ukraine to create its security will create an internal crisis potential. The already mentioned resilience will be put at threat, at risk. Proxy, cyber strikes, polarization, all the terrorist activities under foreign flag, these are the biggest threats today, and this is something that we know. And we should not really actually use those simple communiques or statements when Russian divisions will attack NATO. Thank you, General. You mentioned Belarus. Let me pick Ambassador Szatkowski's mind and ask him, what view of Belarus has NATO today? Is it the Russian territory, as a matter of fact? What is the philosophy? And the second question, you also mentioned that NATO speaks a lot about China. Is there any fear that China will get involved in the war and that China will directly or indirectly support Russia in a military way in this war, in this conflict? Your first question was about Belarus. We are trying to have the same level of awareness within NATO as we have in Poland, namely that Belarus is de facto part of Russian military mechanism. Not everyone, not every single ally is fully aware of it. There is an attempt at trying Belarus as a certain separate player who, in a way, could influence the position of Moscow. But I think this is not really taking place. China, well, it seems that the most convenient alliance for China is protracting the conflict. Probably China would not be interested in either a decisive victory of Russia or a decisive victory of the West. The allies in NATO, especially those who have got interests and are active on the other side of the globe, try to convey this message to China in a clear way, saying that such involvement, of course, would have its consequences for the relations. But now let me also comment on the role of the armed forces. I have to move closer to General. Well, Minister, of course, liberal and democratic states use their armed forces as a tool of their foreign policy in peacetime, and they send such a signal both inside and outside, and also General is well aware of that. I'm, of course, basing my assessment on the briefings that we have in NATO. In those briefings, it transpires that it's important to show our military effort that we are making. It shows our strength. Thank you, Ambassador. You also said about sometimes lacking full coherence of the alliance. You mentioned the Hungary. So, Mr. Budzic, how do you assess the position of Hungary in the situation of a clear threat by Russia? And how about the visits paid in Moscow? How do you assess the fact that Hungary will be blocking the membership of... Hungary was blocking, the membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO. Then this blockade was removed. So how should we assess NATO's political coherence from this perspective? I've got a clear assessment. It is a negative assessment. This policy is contrary to the interest of Poland, as I understand it, as I interpret it. Actually, we would have to open up the entire seminar dedicated to Hungarian policy, try to look for an answer why Hungary has decided to take these steps. The policy of Hungary, I believe, confirms the fact that the NATO member states are looking their own ways by trying to implement their individual interests. And this does not always have to be in conflict with the idea of the coherence of NATO, that we are seeing a separate policy followed by Turkey, a separate policy of Hungary. To a certain extent, I believe it is coordinated with Turkey. And finally, last but not least, we are seeing quite clear separate views in terms of security taken by such countries as France and Germany. Paradoxically, Hungary does not want to increase its defense spending up to the level of 2%. They are not just implementing it. They are not standing out among other countries, such as those more affluent countries. So there is a diversity. We are seeing that the situation is getting complex, and I think this should make diplomacy more intensive in Poland if we want to play a bigger role within NATO. The bonds have to be strengthened, and they have to go not only from Brussels towards the member states, but also they have to be created among the member states. A very good example is the one of our relations with Sweden and Finland. The security in the Baltic Sea is the area which should now make us very active politically and diplomatically. I would, for instance, argue that we should exponentially increase efforts in this direction, for this area is immensely important. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to comment? Defense spending, I believe that this is not a problem in the relations with Hungary. Of course, there was a situation where Hungary neglected, to a large extent, the shape and the condition of the armed forces, but this has recently changed, and now Hungary has become one of the proponents of increasing defense spending in NATO, also to show their own contribution. And Hungary is spending most of its money on modernization in Germany. It is quite interesting, by the way. Sir, you mentioned the seminar. I think, of course, it would deserve to have a separate discussion on the role and cooperation of our Hungarian friends within NATO. It could be surprising. There are different constellations of cooperation than the ones in the European Union, but let me leave this aside, maybe. We've got 2 minutes, Minister. I think there are 2 questions I would like to comment on, Belarus and Hungary. The main problem is the relationship with Russia. I'm not convinced whether putting on a par Russia and Belarus is adequate, is proper. Belarus is not an active participant in the war. There are no Belarusian forces fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Russian ones, but for sure there is a military cooperation and so on and so forth. Our difficulty to make a difference is the fact that the Lukashenko regime sees Poland as a country which wanted to have political changes contrary to Lukashenko's interests. And I think that because of that, we have pushed, so to speak, Lukashenko's regime into the arms of Russia. And I'm not sure whether it was not a mistake made by Poland and other countries, perhaps. But this putting on a par Russia and Belarus, I don't think it's that obvious. It's worth listening to the Ukrainians. They can see the differences between Belarus and Russia. Now, speaking about the role of the armed forces, let me remind you about the doctrine of President Komorowski, which was justly criticized. That doctrine said that Poland should withdraw our forces, among others, from the UN peacekeeping operations. That was a certain mistake in 2019. Now Poland has come back to the peacekeeping operations. We've got our soldiers in Lebanon, and this is the proper way of using armed forces in peacekeeping missions. It is obvious for me, and we should follow on this path. But we should also see different conditionalities and different views of other countries. The Scandinavian states, for example, participate in the UN operations, and this strengthens their international position. So I'm positive about strengthening the armed forces. I'm speaking also about international involvement, not only for the sake of the defense of the territory, but this is, of course, an overarching goal. Thank you, Minister. I think we have run out of time. Unfortunately, we have not been able to tackle all the subjects in detail, but I believe this is a very good preparation for the second part of the debate among experts, which will be a closed debate. I would like to extend my warm gratitude to our speakers, General Ambassador, Minister, Madam Deputy Director, and thank you for being here with us, for your contribution to the discussion. A big thank you to the National Security Bureau, a big thank you to Minister Jacek Siewiera. Thank you very much, and now we will go for a break.